Hey, Calvin, can you see me? Uh, so thank you everyone for joining us today for our second lecture this semester, fourth and final for this academic year, for the Contemporary Aristotelian Studies in Ethics and Politics. Today we have Professor May Sim from Holy Cross, and she is continuing to work on a project. And I'm going to invite you to say a little bit about the whole project, May, before you start your paper. But today's paper is Minimal Morality and Human Rights, East and West. And I will turn it over to you.
All right, let's see if I bet I have to do it twice. So let's see if this works. All right, now I'm going to try to advance. And is it advancing?
It is not advancing.
All right, so I need to redo it. So let me stop the share. I stop, and then I will share again. And this one looks like it'll advance.
There we go.
So is this one advancing?
Yes, it is.
All right, great.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so my talk today is titled Minimal Morality and Human Rights, East and West. And Aristotle will be the representative of the West, and the East would be represented by Confucius and Mengzi, mostly Mengzi. So let me do this. So Jeff has asked me to talk a little bit about this project. And the overall project is my work on human rights. And the first talk was on transgenerational justice, deriving resources from Mengzi and Aristotle for generations of people in future whom we would never meet, and ask how it is that these virtue-oriented ethicists and philosophers can offer resources for deriving human rights for the people in the future generation. Now, my second lecture was titled Rethinking Perfectionism and Human Rights for Aristotle and the early Confucians. And in that talk, what I emphasized was the perfectionist aspect of a virtue-oriented morality. And if you think about a perfectionism in these thinkers, it can be construed as a maximal morality and how it might provide the resources for demanding human rights for people in the Aristotelian and the Confucian traditions. Now, today's talk will be focused on a minimal morality from these thinkers and how we might derive human rights from a more minimalistic and imperfectionistic conception from them. So Aristotle and the early Confucians, Confucius and Mengzi, agree that the completely virtuous people make the best rulers. But they also agree that not everyone is completely virtuous. In fact, most aren't. And even though the majority of people are not perfectly virtuous for them, they can be transformed by having virtuous models. So the result is what I want to call a minimal morality. So people, the majority of them who are somewhat moral, but imperfectly virtuous. And the questions that I'll ask about this minimal conception of morality for both traditions are the following. What are their attitudes toward a minimal morality? Are they accepting of such a minimalism, or are they critical of it? How easy is it to access such a minimal morality, ensuring that for the most part, the majority of people are minimally moral? And are there conditions for accessing such a minimal morality? These are conditions such as the political, social, cultural, or economic conditions. And what's the relation between a minimal morality and the moral principles of each? And for these moral principles, I'll be relying on their respective human natures. Now, comparing Aristotle and these early Confucians and evaluating them, I'll ask which of these traditions' accounts of minimal morality is more accessible, and which is easier to implement when lacking the Tao or an ideal polis, and which offers more resources for claiming the rights to becoming fully moral. Now, here's an outline of my talk. Aristotle and Mengzi, for instance, agree that human nature is set up to become virtuous. And the purpose of a state for both of them is to make people good or virtuous. So the purpose of the state is not just to provide the economic goods or material self-sufficiency. Now, both traditions agree that people play different roles and have different occupations in the state, which in turn lead to their possession of different virtues. And Aristotle offers us a multiplicity of constitutions or regimes as opposed to the single regime of kingship, which is the equivalent of a larger family for the Confucians. Now, Aristotle offers us three legitimate constitutions and their respective deviations, whereas the Confucians offer only one, kingship, and one deviation. For Aristotle, he'll end up saying that for the most part, a good citizen is not the same as a good man. But for the Confucians, then there's this talk of the xiangyuan, or the village worthy, who is definitely not a good man. And finally, I will compare them on the use of laws and customs in governing a state. So to begin then, human nature for Aristotle and Mengzi is to be perfected in becoming virtuous. So they agree on this point. So for Aristotle, as I've shown in the past, there is this sole division into the rational and the non-rational parts, which in turn, the rational part is perfected in the virtues of practical wisdom, phronesis, and Sophia. And these are the intellectual virtues, and the priority is given to the intellectual virtues of contemplation of unchangeable goods over practical wisdom, which deals with things that change. And the non-rational part is to be perfected in moral virtues such as courage, generosity, justice, etc., which will provide the ends or the goals toward which practical wisdom would deliberate. Now, for Mengzi, what we have is a human nature that is equally constituted by the four feelings of compassion for the suffering, shame or disdain toward wrong actions, reverence toward one's elders, and the approval of what is right, the feeling of approval of what is right, and the feeling of disapproval for what is wrong. And when perfected, the resulting virtues are benevolence corresponding to the feeling of compassion, righteousness corresponding to the feelings of shame and disdain, ritual propriety corresponding to the feeling of reverence for elders, and wisdom corresponding to the feeling of approval of what is right and disapproval of what is wrong. Now, Aristotle and the Confucians agree that certain conditions are required for cultivating the virtues so that human beings are not automatically already virtuous. So habituation of the moral virtues is required for Aristotle and cultivation of the virtues for the Confucians. Now, Aristotle and the Confucians would agree that these conditions involve the family and the state. For Aristotle, the laws in the state would inform the families what sorts of virtues to cultivate. And for the Confucians, likewise, the family and the state would be involved instead of laws. The Confucians would prescribe rituals or customs, and these are prescribed behaviors for specific roles and relationships so that children will know how to be filial toward their parents, respectful toward their elders, and so on, governing various social and political relationships in the state. But ultimately, these thinkers would all agree that the unwritten laws or the customs are superior to the written ones. Now, so moving on to the state, or the polis, Aristotle would say that it aims at the highest good, and that is the good life. And the Confucians would agree that it is the life of virtue, but they would disagree with Aristotle that the highest good consists in the elevation of the intellectual virtue of Sophia, of contemplation, over practical wisdom and the moral virtues. And here for Aristotle, he would say that the state is not the equivalent of the family. And the reason is because the state is what enables one to have self-sufficiency and to then move on beyond the daily grind of labor to pursue the good life, the life of virtue, whereas the family is directed toward meeting the daily needs. Now, the Confucians would disagree. For them, the state is the equivalent of a larger family, so that just by serving the family, one is already serving the state. For Aristotle, speech is what distinguishes human beings from animals, and it is what enables us to make clear to each other what is right and what is wrong, what is just and unjust, and it is what enables us to practice the moral virtues in the state. So one is by nature then a political animal. Now, for the Confucians, speech is for the purpose of telling the truth, and this is exercised in the family with the virtues of filial piety and respect for one's elders, and through the rituals in the family of such filial piety and respect, we then gradually extend these virtues into that of benevolence or ren, which is the highest Confucian virtue, and righteousness in the state. So there's a continuity between the virtues in the home and the state for the Confucians, whereas for Aristotle, the virtues are for the most part exercised in public in the state as a political participant. Now, despite agreeing about the state's purpose of making people virtuous, and the goal of every human being is to be perfected in moral virtues, Aristotle and the Confucians agree that not everyone will become perfectly virtuous. And one reason is that the state is composed of people occupying different roles and engaging in different jobs. And these different roles and occupations in turn will lead to their having different virtues. So, for instance, Aristotle maintains that the state then must be composed of unlike persons. And this is analogous to an animal that is made up of a soul and a body, reason, and appetite for the human animal. And the households consisting of a husband and wife, master and slave relationships, as well as the different classes in the city go to make up the state. Now, for the Confucians, division of labor is required to avoid exhaustion. So they do agree with Aristotle about the different roles and occupations that make up the state. And Mengzi says that this is required to avoid exhaustion as opposed to requiring an individual to make everything that he needs. So for Aristotle, the implication of having all these unlike persons make up the state then is that all individuals don't have the same virtues. So for instance, rulers and the citizens will have very different virtues. And Mengzi would agree. He says, quote, some labor with their hearts, some with their strength. And those who labor with their hearts turn out to be the rulers. Those who labor with their strength end up being governed. And those who rule end up being fed. And those who labor with their strength end up feeding the rulers. And this, for Mengzi, is the righteousness, the justice common to the world. So Aristotle compares the different functions in a state to that of sailing. So when it comes to sailing, he sees that there are different things that the sailors do. So there are oarsmen, helmsmen, lookout people, and so forth. And their definitions of excellence then would also vary according to their respective jobs. Now, for the Confucians too, the state is made up of rulers, subjects, artisans, hired laborers. That is, I stand corrected, that is still for Aristotle, and that the temperance and justice would differ in rulers and subjects, so that the ruler should possess wisdom and the subjects right opinion. And sometimes hired laborers are excluded from exercising goodness, just as the slaves definitely are. So there's a common definition of excellence for all when it comes to sailing, and that is security in navigation, just as in state, all the citizens come together to pursue the security of the community, which is the Constitution, and that pursuit and ability to contribute to that pursuit is what contributes to the citizens' excellence. Now, the Confucians would agree that there are different roles that lead to different virtues also in the state. So Emperor Shun, for instance, employed Yu to control the floods. Gao Yao is the minister of crime. Mr. Yi deals with fire clearing, and the farmers will manage agriculture. And it is Emperor Shun's kindness that distinguished people by their talents and benevolence that enables him to employ them, quote, for the sake of the world. Now, as we go through this talk, you'll notice that the Confucians are constantly emphasizing a more global perspective and outcome to rulership compared to the more state-specific benefits in Aristotle's view of politics. Now, so furthermore, Sage Xun appointed Xie as Minister of Instruction. So instruction needs to be provided to the people so that they are aware that between fathers and their children, there is affection, rulers and ministers, there's righteousness, husband and wife distinction, and elder and younger, there's precedence, and between friends, there's faithfulness. So here, as Mengzi puts it, there are activities of the great people and affairs of the petty people, end quote. Rulers and ministers don't have the leisure to farm. Yao and Xun applied their hearts, that is their heart mind, a model after heaven. So there is one model of correct ruling, and they applied that to ruling and not to farming. So this then is going to contrast, as you'll see, with Aristotle's multiple regimes where there are different models for ruling. So if Aristotle and the Confucians agree that different people play different roles that are fulfilled by different virtues in a state, then they would also agree that not everyone in a state is perfectly virtuous. Most have a minimal morality that enables them to contribute to the good of the community. And most people then are neither the phronimos nor the sage. Now, when it comes to Aristotle's definition of a regime, a constitution, he states the following: a constitution, politeia, is the ordering taxis of a state, poleos, according to a different ruler, archon, and especially sovereign, kurias of all, panton. For the government, politeiuma, is everywhere sovereign over the state, and the constitution is the government. So depending on the constitution, different people then will be sovereign. So in a democracy, the people; in an oligarchy, it's the oligarchs. In contrast, what the Confucians have is one single regime of kingship, where kingship is legitimate if the king has received the mandate from heaven, and then followed by rulers of various regions, ministers, etc., in a feudal system. Now, so Aristotle then believes that the constitutions are divided into the government by one or few or the mass of citizens with an eye to the common interest, and that is what makes it a legitimate government. Whereas for the Confucians, it is when the king uses his virtue to exercise benevolence, spreading his love for his family to the rest of the people in the state and caring for them, that can make the people genuinely submit because it pleased their hearts. So in contrast, it is when a government is directed at pursuing its own private interests that would contribute to the deviation from the legitimate or correct governments for Aristotle. And for the Confucians, for Mengzi, he says that hegemon is, quote, somebody who uses power to feign benevolence. Power is inadequate to make their hearts submit. So it's not legitimate because the people are not willing to be ruled by the hegemon. So for Aristotle, the three legitimate constitutions are as follows: kingship being ruled by one, aristocracy being ruled by a few, and constitutional government in which the multitude would rule. And Aristotle thinks that it is possible for the one or the few to excel in virtue, but it is very difficult for the multitude to have perfect virtue. But when it comes to war, they can excel because of their sheer numbers. So when it comes to a constitutional government ruled by the multitude, it's made up of the military class that possesses the arms. So the three deviations from legitimate rule for Aristotle are tyranny being a deviation from kingship because it pursues the monarch's interest, oligarchy, which is a deviation from aristocracy because it's pursuing the interest of the rich, and democracy, which is a deviation from constitutional government because it is directed at pursuing the interest of the poor. None of these governs for the common good for Aristotle. So here, Aristotle, this is another explanation from Aristotle why he would disagree with the Confucian view that the family is just a larger, the state is just a larger family. And reason is because for him, the kingship is not the same as household rule because household rule rules over the slaves, which in turn is in pursuit of the interest of the master and only incidentally that of the slave, whereas kingship is directed at the pursuit of the state's common good. Moreover, household rule over children is for the interest of the ruled, and this is distinct from state rule over equal and similar citizens who would take turns to rule. So household rule is never conducted in such a way that children will in turn rule their parents. So quoting Aristotle, he says, a polis is a partnership, a koinonia of free men. So we have already seen that people's virtues differ from their different roles and occupations for both Aristotle and the Confucians. But added to that, Aristotle's view of differences in constitutions also mean that there are different goodness for citizens, since their excellence is relative to the security of the constitution. So he states, if there are various forms of constitution, there cannot be one single goodness, which is the perfect teleon goodness of the good citizens, spoudaio politou. But a good man possesses one single goodness, perfect goodness. So a good state then must have good citizens for Aristotle, but it is not necessary for them to be good men or perfectly virtuous. And we've seen that in his three legitimate constitutions, it is possible for a king and a few aristocrats to have perfect virtue, but not the multitude. For the Confucians, a good state necessarily has good people. And why? It is because the kingship is the family writ large, so that good family members go on to contribute to the good state and provide world peace. So as Mencius states it, if every individual would treat their parents as parents and their elders as elders, the world would be at peace, end quote. Quote, people have a common saying, the world, the state, the family. The root of the world lies in the state. The root of the state lies in a family. The root of the family lies in oneself, end quote. The good person at home then is the source of the good in the world. So it has a global effect in contrast to Aristotle's view. Again, here the family is the intermediary between the individual and the state. quote, treat your elders as elders and extend it to the elders of others. Treat your young ones as young ones and extend it to the young ones of others. And you can turn the world in the palm of your hand, showing how easy it is to extend your proper behavior and virtues in the home to strangers in the outside world. So extending one's love, respect, and kindness from one's own family to strangers is the perfection of benevolence, or Ren, so that it's the same virtue of Ren in and outside of the family. Now, Aristotle is different from the Confucians in that he will prioritize the state over the family. Why? Because the family caters to our daily needs, but it is being a citizen of a state that enables the whole city to have self-sufficiency, and hence one is released from the laboring for daily needs to pursue the good life, so that the life of virtue, such as being just, courageous, honorable, generous, etc., has to be a privilege of a citizen that does not have to cater to menial labor. So Aristotle defines a citizen in full sense as a man who shares in the honors of the state, so that the best ordered state, for instance, an aristocracy, would not be constituted by citizens who are slaves, hired laborers, or the artisans. Rather, the honors depend on the citizens' virtues and their worth, which would exclude the manual laborers. But he does say that in a different constitution, such as an oligarchy, it is possible for artisans to also be citizens because they are capable of being rich. Now, for the Confucians, just being filial to parents and fraternal to brothers is doing the work of government, so that one need not be employed in governing to be virtuous or to have worth. In fact, Confucius would encourage someone to withdraw from serving in a government in corrupt times. So here, I'm going to deal with the issue of how they govern according to rituals, that is the customary prescribed behaviors for different roles and relationships or laws. So I quote Confucius's Analects here, the excellence, the de, of the exemplary person, the junzi, is the wind. The petty persons is the grass. As the wind blows, the grass must bend. And this illustrates the effortlessness of governing by rituals, just the exemplariness of the excellent person provides the inspiration for everybody else to also be virtuous. In contrast, Confucius maintains that governing with penal law, xing, keeps people orderly but without shame. Leading them with de and through the rituals will inspire them to have shame and order themselves. I quote, people turn toward run like water flowing downward or animals running toward the wilds. So here, Mengzi would agree with Confucius that governing well and with the rituals would inspire people to become virtuous too. So governing by rituals for the Confucians is very non-minimal, and it shows their intolerance of a minimal morality, if you will. Here, both Confucius and Mengzi talk about what they call the xiangyuan, or the village worthy, one who is reputed to be moral in the community, but who is internally and morally bankrupt. Confucius says, quote, "The village worthy is excellence under false pretenses." And Mengzi agrees with Confucius that they are the thieves of virtue, and because they'll always agree with the accepted customs in a state. So, quote, "Born in this era, we should be for this era," end quote, is the attitude of these village worthies. So despite being acknowledged by the entire village, their apparent harmony with their era is a seeming devotion, faithfulness, purity and blamelessness of their actions. So it's all an appearance. They're far from the way of the ancient sages, such as Yao and Xun. So Confucius's hatred is that they'd be confused for those with genuine virtue. Now, what's a correspondence to the imperfect person with minimal virtues in Confucianism, the village worthies? How about the incontinent and continent people for Aristotle? Does this reflect a tolerance from him regarding their minimal morality? So as we all know, the incontinent person is someone who fails to abide by his reason or decision. And reason is because he is overcome by his desires. So despite his knowing that he shouldn't be eating the whole cake at one sitting, for instance, being overcome by his appetite for food, he eats the whole cake at one sitting. But nevertheless, the incontinent person is not incorrigible because he has regrets, and hence he is curable. Now, in contrast, the continent person is somebody who reasons to the right conclusion and actually is able to abide by his reason. But he's not already a virtuous person like the temperate person, because he still has the very strong desires to eat the whole cake. But so neither is the incontinent nor the continent person as low as the Confucian's village worthy, who simply just has the appearance of virtue, which appearance then is actually a threat to the genuine virtues. And is this because of the robust interior, despite the struggles in these individuals? Is that what these thinkers would agree about in perhaps, some positivity that can be accorded to incontinence and continence? Now, returning then so that's a little digression to talk about how important it is that rituals permeate the whole individual's character and not just be a superficial, abide by certain motions kind of behavior. So here, contrary to the Confucius's criticism of rule by law, Aristotle states, quote, "It is clear that when men seek for what is just, they seek for what is impartial, for the law is that which is impartial." So this is something that goes against Confucius's recommendation of just not trusting laws to do the ruling. So some things, though, Aristotle would say, cannot be determined by laws. Quote, "If the virtuous man justly deserves to rule because he is better, yet two men are better than one." So this kind of shows you Aristotle's suspicion about the single ruler of a monarch. He thinks that, well, two minds are actually better than a singular ruler. And again, quote, monarchs make many eyes and ears and hands and feet their own, for they adopt persons that are friendly to their rule and to themselves as their fellow rulers. So showing that in addition to the impartiality of laws, if you need to rely on individual rulers at all, kings having multiple advisors is the better way of ruling. So the unwritten laws, Aristotle would agree, which are like the lead of ritual proprieties for the Confucians, are actually prior and more effective than the written laws. Quote, customary laws are more sovereign and deal with more sovereign matters than written laws. So that if a human ruler is less liable to error than laws, yet his is not less liable to error than the laws of custom. So both of these traditions then would agree that what is customary in a society ends up being more effective and powerful in getting people to behave in certain ways. And Mengzi too agrees on how it is that laws are just ineffective. As he says, mere laws don't put themselves into effect. And if the benevolent people don't rule, then evil would befall the multitude. And if those above lack the way, namely the rulers, below will lack laws. So laws are only as good as the people who promulgated them. So when it comes to education, when asked about the large population of Wei, Confucius's response is to make them prosperous, but also to educate them. So Mengzi recommends a kingly rule that secures a constant livelihood, which includes the leisure to be educated in rituals and righteousness at the village schools. Now, in contrast, Aristotle recommends a system of education that is tailored to the constitution. So depending on whether it's an oligarchic or democratic constitution, the citizens would receive a different sort of education. For Aristotle's view is that it is useless for laws if they are to be ratified by the citizens if they are not educated in their constitution. Now, in contrast to the Confucians who believe that village schools should be set up to educate everyone, Aristotle's view is that only citizens will be educated. And the implication is that slaves, laborers, and so on, depending on your constitution, those who are non-citizens would not receive the education of the constitutions. So what are the resulting views on minimal morality from my comparison of these two traditions? Aristotle limits the perfect virtues to the few, whereas for the Confucians, more can be fully virtuous, as most people have families to help them cultivate the virtues of benevolence and righteousness. And so what I've shown is that by limiting human perfection, by his own definition of human flourishing, so back to the soul division and human function chart or slide I showed earlier, I think that Aristotle is not fulfilling his general definition of what a human being is and how one is to be perfected. For the Confucians, in contrast, they do abide by, at least Mengzi does, abide by his view of human nature, whereby we're already born with the four feelings that incline us toward the perfection of the four virtues, so that all human beings are exactly the same as the sage for him, so that they can be perfected too. So what Aristotle does is that he then ends up excluding those who are less fortunate by birth from perfecting their virtues, so that for him there's actually a more of a minimal morality going on in his various political rules. Whereas for the Confucians, the sage rule secures the constant livelihood and leisure to cultivate rituals and righteousness, so that there's less of a minimal morality and that more is expected of the people to become virtuous. So, ending now with my spiel about human rights as the conditions for virtues. What I've shown then is that Aristotle's minimal morality tolerates the conditions of fortunes, so that the slaves, hired laborers, etc., are, relegated to a very minimalistic morality, so that they can just do whatever job they're supposed to do, and they have no opportunity for citizenship, and they won't be educated about their constitutions, nor would they end up demanding the rights to be educated or cultivated or exercise the virtues. Here, for the Confucians, despite their agreement with Aristotle about the variety of roles and occupations in a state, there's no separation of the private from the public roles for virtues. So if everyone is to cultivate the virtues, then everyone has the right to be educated, and also to exercise the virtues is actually something that is compatible with Confucianism. So what can the Confucians learn from Aristotle? I want to say that the variety of regimes in which more people can participate in politics or ruling rather than just a singular ruler like the king. So since people, for the Confucians, can cultivate their virtues beginning in a home by according with ritual propriety, they can know the standards of goodness to deliberate affairs of the state. So they can ascertain if the government officials are actually doing their jobs, and so they can also engage in politics. Now, what can Aristotle learn from the Confucians? To be more inclusive on who can be virtuous. So virtues like benevolence and righteousness can be exercised outside of government service. And the rituals or customs, which Aristotle already admits are important, can help him extend these virtues to everyone, and also to adopt the leisure for education that is so important for the Confucians, can also extend virtue beyond the few to the many. And with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, May. I really appreciated that. Very clear as always, and informative. I'm sure lots of people have lots of questions, so we'll open them up. Do you want to do the Q&A yourself, or do you want me to call on people?
Yes, let me see if I could put the gallery up so that I can see the hands, if there are any hands, or yes, Hutch, go ahead.
I was just wondering, based on, and I know you kind of like touched upon it right there at the end, but for Aristotle, if he also believes in the unwritten rules and similar to the rituals of the Confucians, how would he be able to separate the family from the state if the understanding is that still within the household rules, the the family will be teaching the children, and therefore like how to those that will be growing up to become citizens, how to act. So how is that not in a way, I guess, a contradiction of his own belief that the family and state are separated?
Good, I see your point. And here, I think that Aristotle doesn't deny that the family can inculcate the virtues in the children who then can go on to become citizens, as long as they're well born. That's the qualification he will make. And the thing is that what he wants to insist upon is that as long as one is a child and living in the privacy of the home rather than sitting in the right along with the other citizens of the state deliberating, okay, should we go to war or not, what should we do with the care of these people and so forth, what's good for the whole state, that child is not yet a citizen. So it's perfectly fine for him to undergo that habituation in the home. But in order for him to become a citizen, he needs to be completely severed from the privacy of the home, in that he won't be required to tend to his daily needs. And that's why, slavery is a thing for these Greeks. They need the slaves to take care of the daily needs so that they are freed from the labor that would distract them from their deliberations in the state. Does that answer your question?
So would yes, but just to clarify, would that also mean that you could say Aristotle believes more in the unwritten rules, the unwritten rituals once the individual has become a citizen, and before that it's kind of less important to the
Well, I think that when it comes to the unwritten laws and customs, they are important, whether, it's in the privacy of one's home or in the public, because they inform people about the customs, what's right to do. It's the unspoken rule. So for instance, right, the custom right now in the Zoom setting is that you won't say turn on your mic and have your loud music blaring while we're having this session, right? That's unspoken, and it's effective, right? That there's a customary behavior that we all expect. So those apply to the family as well as in public. So it's very much like the ritual propriety in the Confucians. Does that
Thank you.
answer? All right, thank you very much for your questions. Yes, Kennedy, you're next.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. That was a very enjoyable talk. I was wondering, so when we talk about human rights, as I understand it, you're trying to build some sort of foundation for human rights using sort of Confucian and Aristotelian theory. I don't know very much about Confucius. I do know a bit about Aristotle. I was kind of wondering, like, the way that you framed this talk, it seems to be very much about sort of domestic rights. I was wondering if you have anything to say about sort of like international rights and how, the particular sort of threads that you're extracting might have to do with that.
Good. That is a good question. And you notice that as I was comparing the two traditions, I alluded to the global nature of the Confucian virtues, how it is that ultimately they are to be extended not only to one's own family, community, state, but to the rest of the world. So what they can do then is to appeal to their account of benevolence, whereby the love for one's family is extended gradually to all, ultimately sort of, right, the whole cosmic world. So it includes nature as well. So when it comes to international concerns, I think that they do have resources for us to explore. Now, insofar as Aristotle's concerns are kind of relative to the various constitutions, that might limit the international aspect or of what we can derive from him in terms of international resources or resources for international concerns. Does that answer your question?
That was helpful. I do have a follow-up. Do you mind if I ask a follow-up? So once again, I sort of said I don't know very much about Confucius, unfortunately. But I was wondering if you're seeking, if Confucius is anything like Aristotle, and once again I don't know very much about Confucius, but if you're trying to sort of extend sort of a global conception of human rights on the basis of sort of the effective relationships we have with our families, for instance, and extending those globally. I was wondering if, and this is sort of predicated on the fact that, Confucius might be a little bit like Aristotle. Aristotle has sort of a very particular specific idea about what morality is. And globally, I mean, liberalism isn't great, but one of the great things about liberalism is it sort of renders many different sort of conceptions of the good, many different ways in which we might sort of live our lives, in some sense, compatible with each other. So I was wondering, whether the approach that you're advocating for is sort of compatible with accepting sort of a very, very big variety of sort of different legitimate ways of living life.
Thank you. That's more the topic that I tackled in the second lecture, where I did try to defend a Confucian perspective on perfectionism and how that in turn allows for a kind of liberalism or more liberal perspective than some Confucian commentators have attributed to them. So you notice that on one of the slides, I discuss how it is that virtues, right, start from the individual and then they go global, the individual through the family to the state and then to the world. So there are resources in the Confucians for fairly individual and self-deterministic view, insofar as it is related to being moral, being good. So in short, they're not going to be so liberal as to embrace any and everything that you offer them. So last time, for instance, we had a discussion about casual sex, right? So would they encourage someone to just go out and have a different partner every night? And that is not going to be supported by them simply because it is not going to be conducive to one's development of the virtues. because it encourages a very callous attitude of relating to one another, so that it's not valuing and respecting the other individual. So in that regard, I think that the Confucians have more to offer than any, run-of-the-mill, everyday liberal in the Western world, because they are going to have a basic set of standards to adjudicate, okay, what's acceptable and what's not. And I think that that's a question, a challenge for the liberals too, because if you allow any and everything, then how are you going to decide when, right, these different values conflict? Which particular interest or value then is supposed to take priority? Have I
Thank you.
answered?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Yes, Jeff.
Thank you. I have a bunch of questions, but I'll try to keep many of them quick. The first one's actually just you can say a very little bit about it and then maybe direct me to a book. And the second and third one are a little bit, I think, more intensive. So you talked about Tao a couple of times in all of your lectures, and I just wondered if you could say a little bit, a sentence or two about the relationship between Taoism and Confucianism, and then maybe point me to a book that might address that. The second question is about the concept of benevolence, because we don't find that virtue in Aristotle, and I wondered if you thought that would play a significant role in how we would reconcile Aristotle and Confucius, and more particularly, if we say, oh, benevolence is a virtue, does that really get rid of all the problems that Aristotle has? And then related to that, and certainly one you can say more or less about depending on how you feel, is where does justice to women fit in here? Because you've talked a little bit about slavery, but of course women are a part of that issue of less rationality for Aristotle, and I don't know how that fits into the Confucianism. So sorry, I got a bunch of questions, and I hope that some of them make sense. Thank you.
All right, as long as they fit on one hand, 3, I can count to 3 and hopefully remember those 3 questions. So when it comes to the Confucians and the Taoists, that's such an exciting comparison. And in fact, I have an article that is coming out comparing Confucianism and Taoism. So I will share that information with you. And in fact, this whole topic of minimal morality came up because I was invited to contribute to this anthology on minimal morality, and then I came up by comparing the Confucians and the Taoists on minimal morality. And guess what? The result was that the Taoists have a more minimalistic morality, but then it puts a lot of burden on the sage. He has to do everything. So that the people, basically they will just follow along and do everything effortlessly because everything has been arranged for them. But the Confucians will end up demanding more of the people because they also believe, so that kind of bleeds over to my comparison with Aristotle today, because they do have this fundamental belief that human beings are capable of becoming virtuous. And for the monks, that's your human nature. Your human nature is such that you're already propelled toward the perfection in the virtues. Yeah, but that comparison is, there are lots of contrasts between them. In a sense that if you think about the Confucians, they're all for cultivation. You need to try. You need to keep, right, acting according to the rituals in such a way that then they become effortless. So that's where the Taoist element comes in. But the Taoists are really anti-trying. They subscribe to this no trying, no acting for a specific goal way of living with the Tao and according to the Tao. And reason is because the Tao is not something that is definite and fixed and limited, but rather it's right, the source of everything, and it's open to transforming any and everything. So that is not partial, if you will. All right, so I'll stop there for that question on the Tao. And the other question has to do with benevolence. And Aristotle, if you look at his rhetoric, he actually talks about benevolence in his rhetoric. So there it seems quite comparable to the Confucians, but here I'm not looking for term translations when it comes to the virtues, but rather I believe in going with the functional equivalence way of dealing with them. So if you think about benevolence or Ren, or my preferred translation is really humaneness, but to a public audience, I think benevolence conveys the idea, just out of sheer habit. And there, if you think about benevolence as requiring for the Confucians the possession of all of the other moral virtues, so it's more like the crown of virtues, then the functional equivalent for Aristotle then would be the virtue of phronesis, or practical wisdom. So I don't think that Aristotle encounters the problems that I raise for him because he lacks this particular virtue that seems all-encompassing and enables one to deal with all of the particular situations and their changes. I think that he has the resources that the Confucians have, and the question is, right, how they end up being, right, unfolding, if you will, in their uses. And then, of course, we talk about their limitations. All right, your last question is about women. And yes, I'm frequently asked that question simply because, right, of who I am. And but I shamelessly embrace the philosophies of the Confucians and Aristotle because I believe that they can transcend their cultural limitations. And that's why I always go back to their human natures, right? Their metaphysics, and how it is that, hey, this is the nature of a human being, and this is how it is perfected. And regardless of what they say, in particular, in various occasions that might put down the female, right? It is not an issue. I think that can be accommodated. I can say that they're just wrong and they were stuck somehow, right, affected by their cultures, but that doesn't mean that they don't have the resources to transcend those limitations. Have I answered your questions?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Other questions? Yes, Calvin?
Right, May, thanks for that. That was excellent. One resource that it seems to me is available to Aristotle is the idea of citizenship, and what people in his culturally conditioned categories are do not participate in is citizenship, or we could say, following Gennadi's question about the international, yeah, we're talking about geographically specific political communities, both in Aristotle's time and now. But nonetheless, the idea of citizenship implies the cultivation of the virtues through one's own actions and reasoning, which is, I'm sure you'll agree, central to Aristotle's ethics and politics. But it's not clear to me to what extent that resource of, let's call it citizenship or self-activity, free self-activity, which is surely related to the idea of rights, citizens' rights, or more generally human rights. It's not obvious to me that that resource is available to Confucians, where we might say, from a Western ethnocentric perspective, perhaps, as has historically been said, only one is free. There's only one political actor, whereas in Aristotle's idea of citizenship, everyone with that status is a political actor, ruling and being ruled in turn. So, my question is, to what extent is that, to my mind, very important resource available to Confucius and perhaps contemporary Confucians?
Good, thank you. And you're absolutely right that neither Aristotle nor the Confucians were familiar with the concept of rights, right? So this is actually an exercise to bring them up to date with the contemporary. I mean, this is right about contemporary Aristotelian studies, and human rights turns out to be one of my concerns that is quite contemporary. And so I thought that it'll be right a good exercise to think about the resources from these individuals. So you're absolutely right that they didn't have such an understanding at all. But if they were alive today, so here we're dealing with the contemporary Aristotelians and contemporary Confucians, the question is, what then does each of these philosophies have to offer to using rights as tools to, say, grant individuals the resources for defending themselves if they were under certain conditions when their freedoms were to be threatened. And I agree with you that citizenship seems to be quite robust in Aristotle, in that there are, right, these multiplicity of regimes. And my goodness, even when it comes to democracy alone and oligarchy, that they're subdivided into various types depending on the nature of the people. So it seems like he has thought very carefully about these various regimes, and he's respecting the plurality and variety of these people living in their conditions, and acknowledging that, hey, if you live under different circumstances, you have a different way to perfect yourself, to cultivate the virtues, and so forth. So for that, I think that he's absolutely right. But what I'm trying to point out in today's talk is that there are also limitations, because he seems to take these various regimes to be given by nature. He doesn't seem to want to change them, but rather he thinks, okay, this is how it'll work for these people, as opposed to oligarchs, as opposed to the Democrats, and so forth. And he works within those limitations, so much so that he is not challenging the fact that, okay, what about all these guys, the hired laborers and the slaves who don't have freedoms? Aren't they human beings too? And don't they then have, the right to end up perfecting themselves like human beings? So that's the question that I asked. And the irony for the Confucians is that even though one is free, if you want to go with that way of formulating it, nevertheless, it's perhaps their view of the human being that leads them to have that compassion for other people, other human beings that look like them, so that they are not going to end up using them as tools, like Aristotle ended up accepting with the slaves, right? The slaves are just like tools that you would use to enable your daily needs to be met. So ultimately then, following along with their thinking and their attitudes, their respective attitudes toward a human being, any human being, I think that it's fair then to say, okay, if they were given the resources of talking about human rights and claiming human rights, who might be able to do better? Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks. Always strikes me as a little Straussian, let's say, when the emphasis is on regimes. But of course, for Aristotle, at least as I read him, all of the regimes are within the context of political community and therefore citizenship. And granted that both Aristotle and Confucius can be updated, as Aristotle famously allowed, if technology was available, then one would have no need for slaves. And of course, no modern society, no capitalist society does have a place for slavery, whereas citizenship, of course, is an Aristotelian concept that is pretty central to any modern state to varying extents. But anyway, sorry, I see that Tollis, for one, is eager to get in. So thank you very much, May. That was excellent. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yes, Tollis.
Hi, May. Hi, everybody. Thank you very much. I mean, it was very clear as always, and the comparisons, I think, between the two traditions allow us to yeah, they're very thought-provoking and allows us to put them into context. Sometimes, though, the comparisons tend to blunt the differences. And taking off from Kelvin's point about citizenship, I would like to sort of direct our attention to another kind of difference that might exist in the large picture of the two different traditions. And I think that this difference is on how they emphasize or how they focus on the role of reason as opposed to moral virtues. You mentioned a lot, you said a lot about habituation, gradual habituation into moral virtues, virtues of character. I think it's very important in both traditions. On the other hand, it seems that, you know, the classical Greek tradition or even the Aristotelian tradition itself places more emphasis on reason. And if I could extend this kind of perspective on how to view the two traditions, just trying to be provocative here, one might want to say that all the great prophets and founders of religions or you know, ethical, let's say, worldviews, were starting or were led or were motivated by ethical questions about what is the good life, how can a human being be virtuous, etc. It seems that the classical Greek tradition were not led to its insights mainly through the you know, ethical questions, but through theoretical questions about what is the being of beings, you know, the metaphysical tradition. So what this does, I think, for the Greek tradition is that, first of all, it differentiates theoretical reason, theoretical logos from practical logos. It differentiates also theoretical logos seems to be, or metaphysical, let's say, questioning seems to be more distant from the current ethical views. So it allows a kind of more distant, more, let's say, unconditioned view of the universe than if somebody is engaged only in ethical questions where one is more conditioned by the views that go on around him or her. So it seems that if one wants to take the perspective of Jeff's friends, you know, Adorno and Horkheimer, the dialectics of enlightenment, and take this view about how reason comes out of how logos comes out of myth, it seems that the Greek route to that through theoretical questions, through metaphysical questions, and not through ethical questions, seems to allow more of a distancing of reason from myth, of logos from myth. And in that sense, one could argue that, you know, you can see in the Greek tradition a kind of proto-enlightenment, a proto-emancipation of reasoning from ethical virtues, from ethical questions. Also the differentiation in Aristotle that you mentioned made between the rational soul and the irrational soul. To what extent does this exist in Confucius or the Confucian tradition? I don't know. Perhaps you could say something about that. But yeah, this kind of perspective might be fruitful to view the two traditions in a wider picture. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your comments and your question. And, here I'm teaching a seminar this semester on reason and emotion, East and West. And so that's definitely a question that some of my students have been tackling too this semester. And in general, I agree with you that when it comes to the classical Greek tradition, it is very logocentric, very focused on reason, and it takes them in a certain direction. I agree with you entirely. And when it comes to the emotions or the feelings, yeah, they're relegated to a more subservient, role. And here, what I want to say is that there's not a lack of reason in, say, the Confucians, if you will, but it's also not that they, if you think about it, for Mengzi and for Confucius, there is this emphasis on reflection. And that is a function of reason. And Mengzi would say, you don't reflect with your eyes, you don't reflect with your ears, because if you do that, you just won't get it. But you need to reflect with your heart mind. And notice that for them, the heart mind goes together, so that it's never this impassionate, totally impartial reason that is doing the reflection or calculation, but they buy into this view that we are always already informed by these feelings. So Mengzi, for instance, want to say that human nature is good because he thinks that all of us have the feeling of compassion. And he tells, right, the anecdote about the child who is about to fall into the well. He thinks that anyone, any human being who witnesses that, right, incident would go, right, you'll be alarmed, and you'll have this sense of compassion of not wanting anything to happen to the child, even if you don't know the child or his parents, and so forth. But nevertheless, how do we get, they also understand that with these feelings, there is this tendency for us to be nepotistic. We have more feelings for our own, right? Our own family, our loved ones, and so forth. And the question is, what do you do with that? And they really think that you need to overcome that so that you are not living in this world of partiality, but rather, if you think about it, why are you only respectful and caring of your elderly parents? Why are you not also respectful and caring of others' elderly parents, right? If you think about it, all elderly people, they are alike in needing our assistance. So morality then becomes an extension of your own feelings, right? Which you can reason about for your own parents to that of others, so that you gradually widen your scope of activity, and that contributes to our perfection. Now, you're absolutely right that they are not interested, when it comes to these early Confucians, they are not interested in theorizing for the sake of theory. If you can't put it into practice, then it's moot. right? There's no use in engaging in that exercise. So there is always this practical emphasis for them. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a place for reason. They just don't elevate it, and they don't, right, put it on a pedestal and, you know, have it be superior to everything else, as the Greeks have done. And there are certain consequences as a result of the move by the Greeks. And maybe a more holistic move might be informative, might be productive. And so, yeah, if you look at these Eastern traditions, you'll notice that they will tell you that if you want to, you know, unite with the Atman or the Brahman, the intellect is not going to help you. Thought is not going to help you achieve that. But love, right? So are we missing something, right, with our logocentric, you know, move here in the West? If that's what we've been headed, you know, we've been heading and, you know, continue to do so, do we have something to learn whereby we, right, revisit our priorities? And here we think that, yeah, we can just talk internationally, right? We can engage in these talks with these foreign cultures and traditions. And perhaps there's something else that we need to bring to the plate. And perhaps that's an understanding of, right, their emotions. Does that answer your question, Thomas?
Yes, thank you very much. That was very interesting, May. If I may just add one or two thoughts. So for the Confucians, reflection has a very important role. And actually, in some respects, from your answer, I got the impression that what reflection does is creates more and more distance from the filial, the more limited circle, let's say, of social situatedness. So what reflection allows for is to be more distant, to extend to a wider circle your moral virtues, your virtues of character. So reflection through reasoning, I guess, does allow for a much more, let's say, universalistic kind of perspective, even limited kind of universalistic, but still extends and allows more distance. So there is some place for reflection, which is very important for the Confucian. And the second point, from your latest point about Eastern, ethicists or philosophers who think that if you want to unite with the universe, you unite through the heart rather through the intellect, which is exactly the opposite from the Greek, because from Plato to Plotinus, the idea was that, you unite, enosis through the intellect. It's only through the intellect. And of course, this is reflected in Aristotle as well, with the vios theoretikos. That's the ultimate ethical goal, to be able to lead a life which is a theoretical life rather than a civil life, as a good citizen. So yes, there is a divergence there of the traditions. I don't know, which is best. It's a huge question, but yes, there is a divergence, I think, and I agree with you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, a note at this point is that if you notice in both Plato and Aristotle, there is a gap between, say, dianoia and nous, I mean, you're just not going to be able to keep going on the dianoia path to get to the nous. And there is a leap. And you wonder, you know, what's enabling that leap, right? And for what we do in this world that is so bound up with material, right, and matter, to enable us to get to, right, the realm of the immaterial, the totally immaterial. And once again, if you look at some of these Eastern traditions, there is the practice of meditation, and how that is not right, discursive thinking, but something else is going on, and the body is involved. So you know, so that might be a question, right, to put to these traditions. And back to Jeff's earlier question about the Confucians and the Taoists too, they do not like reason. They do not think that reason is going to get you to this indeterminate, indefinite, and indefinable Tao, but rather it's, you know, it's the unity. How do you unite with everything else? And I think that that kind of reason, that kind of unity is going to be more inclusive and universal if it is able to transcend that dualism between the mind and the body. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you.
Kelvin will be upset for me for saying this, but that all leads back to my book. So where I talk about these questions. So thanks for doing that. I like that. With love and reason in Aristotle and coming from Plato. Because I think, you know, when we think about the symposium and that last step, right? What is that last step up the ladder? It doesn't sound like it's reason. And I think there's still some of that in the divided line. Are there any more questions for May? Well, let's thank her once again, and I will send out a schedule probably sometime in mid-July for everyone for the fall. I believe both Kelvin and May said they would do another paper in the fall presentation, and we'll move on from there as we go forward. So thanks everyone for being here. I appreciate it. Have a great day and a great weekend. And those of you who are finishing up the semester, good luck. Thank you, May.
Thanks so much to everyone. I really appreciate you spending time with me. Thanks so much. Have a good weekend, everyone.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
See you later, May.